There you go.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining me today for my presentation and for your patience while I got this started. I am going to be talking today about treating grief and loss related to suicide in a private practice setting. So here's a little overview of what I plan to talk about today. I want to start with a little bit of a brief kind of big picture introduction of grief in private practice generally. Then I'm going to talk about the background of the private practice, the clinician that I spoke to. Then I'm going to go over what suicide loss entails in terms of bereavement. And then I'm really using my interview to kind of shape the rest of my presentation. So I'll talk about the interview and then discuss from that some interventions, also self-care for the therapist, and finally some broader social work recommendations. So grief and loss in a private practice setting. Grief and loss come in many forms. For some, it is the death of a loved one. For others, it is divorce or the end of a relationship. It might be loss of self or even the anticipation of loss. Loss can be expected or unexpected. It can be traumatic. It can even bring us relief. Whatever experience we have with grief and loss, counseling can be beneficial in navigating those tough and sometimes unexpected emotions that might result. And a therapist who is in private practice is likely to see that kind of varied population of grief and see these various types of loss and grief. So I was able to interview Dr. Maritza Robinson, who operates L.B. Johnson Therapeutics in Cyprus. She has family experience of suicide, which she pointed to as being something that really informs her practice. She lost her brother to, excuse me, she lost her brother to suicide, and her mother died 5 years later. She didn't go into great detail on her mother's death, but she did say that she passed away as a result of complicated grief. So for Dr. Robinson, this is both professional and personal. She is also an LCDC and an LCSW, and she maintains an authentic, empathetic, and client-centered approach to help her clients regain their control and to provide a secure and safe space. Dr. Robinson sees people ranging in age from their teens through around age 65. She does individual, family, and group therapy. And as stated earlier, the losses that she sees vary. Some are related to death and some are not necessarily related to death. So I've kind of grouped them here. So she sees loss of self, life transitions. She pointed to people who have experienced more isolation or loss of time due to COVID, also postpartum anxiety or postpartum identity changes, and then depression and anxiety. And all of those can manifest as a loss and require that grieving process. In terms of death-related losses, two of the most common that she sees are suicide and homicide. And these, of course, often lead to complicated grief, as we've discussed in class. Sometimes clients deal with these complicated grief feelings through substance use, and oftentimes blame of themselves comes up as well. And so I'll be focusing specifically on grief related to suicide. So suicide loss. Losing a loved one to suicide is one of life's most painful experiences. That's the quote that I have here. Those who survive suicide loss are at an increased risk of developing major depression, PTSD, suicidal behavior, and of course, complicated grief. In addition to the typical emotions that we would normally expect to see in someone going through grief, someone who is bereaved, Those who are grieving a suicide loss often experience additional complicated emotions that include guilt, confusion, rejection, shame, and anger. And all of these complexities of suicide loss can lead to that complicated grief and kind of interfere with the client's ability to move through those, Worden's 4 tasks of mourning. And additionally, further complicated by the stigma that is still often associated with suicide loss, as well as the trauma of suicide loss. A study comparing the effects of complicated grief over time in those that are bereaved by suicide versus accident or homicide versus natural causes found that grieving due to suicide loss had the highest rates of lifetime depression, pre-loss passive suicidal ideation, self-blaming thoughts, and impaired work and social adjustment. So we can see that suicide loss is a uniquely complicated type of loss, type of grieving process to work with. I asked Dr. Robinson a variety of questions, of course, and these 3 are really what are kind of structuring the rest of my presentation today. And that is, how do you address grief and loss with these clients? How do you as a therapist take care of yourself? And what can social work do to better serve these populations? So Dr. Robinson identified 4 primary interventions that she uses kind of generally with grief and loss, not necessarily specific to suicide. So that is CBT, letter writing, role play, and empty chair. But she pointed in particular to the empty chair technique as being useful, especially with loss related to suicide. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on in terms of kind of delving into a particular intervention for this population. So the empty chair technique is particularly useful when the client has unfinished business with their departed loved one. And in cases of suicide, it makes sense that there would be these things that are left unsaid. It's a very sudden death, unexpected. And the sudden broken bond caused by suicide complicates the mourner's grief process. Not only have they lost their loved one, but their relationship with that person is suddenly broken. And having a dialogue with the deceased helps the mourner to repair that relationship, and that is often a necessary step in order to heal after experiencing a suicide loss. And that dialogue can include, the empty chair technique. So what is the empty chair technique? It comes from Gestalt therapy. And I did a very basic little diagram here. So essentially, the client sits in a chair with a therapist in a chair kind of next to them. And then across from the client, they're facing an empty chair. And the idea is that the empty chair represents the person that they're having the dialogue with. And the therapist guides them through having that dialogue. I found several good YouTube videos that kind of demonstrate that, which I did not include here, but if you are more interested, I definitely recommend just doing a simple YouTube search. And then some broader intervention guidelines, which I also, this is taken from my intervention guideline document, which I will be uploading shortly. And that is number 1, initial support for the traumatic distress of the loss. Losing a loved one to suicide is traumatic. These deaths are sudden. They are sometimes violent and difficult to accept for loved ones. So the therapist should first support the client through this initial stage by acknowledging and validating the client's feelings. Number 2 is referral to a support group. Because suicide loss is often stigmatized, those who lose a loved one to suicide are often reluctant to openly discuss their loss and may even avoid treatment due to fears of stigma or to negative reactions or judgment. So peer support is very helpful in allowing these clients to have a safe space to openly share with others who have experienced something similar to them. And it can also be a way to reduce some isolation that might occur after the loss. Number three, encourage the repair of that broken relationship or resolution of any anger or guilt that might be present for the client through dialogue activities such as the empty chair technique. Um, as discussed, there's often that break of the relationship bond when this occurs. And it's very common for anger or guilt or other difficult emotions to be present. And in order to move past these and to move through the stages of grief, it's helpful for therapists to facilitate or help facilitate this dialogue between the client and their loved one. And finally, referral to a psychiatrist for medication if needed. Given the prevalence of complicated grief in this population, as well as the additional concerns that can arise, including major depression and PTSD, medication can be an important component of treatment. Not always, but can be. So therapists should assess for these issues and make referrals as necessary. So back to second part of the interview that I'm going to focus on a little bit here is self-care, and this is self-care specifically for the social worker, the therapist. So how do you take care of yourself, and what is self-care? And Dr. Robinson had some great insight into that, and self-care is more than what we might see coming from the beauty industry or the self-help industry. It's not just getting your nails done or drinking a green juice. It's, real self-care goes beyond that. Excuse me. Allergies are bad. And Dr. Robinson had 4 areas of self-care that she identified in particular that she makes sure to implement for herself in working with, these very, in some cases, triggering populations to just be sure that she's taking care of herself. So her number one thing was therapy. She said she sees her own therapist, and then that's very helpful for her in making sure that she takes care of herself. She also said to take time off. We definitely have a culture of productivity, and let's see how much we can work, but it's important still to make sure that we take time off. Your employer probably you have time off somewhere, so just be sure to use it. She also pointed to self-reflection, and of course that looks different for different people. For her, she mentioned journaling. That might be, another activity, mindfulness, something like that. And then I thought this was really interesting. She said, date yourself, spend quality time with yourself, let yourself be a priority, and really make an effort to show yourself kindness and love. And of course, we know that working in, with things like grief and loss, it can be very trying on us as a clinician. And so making sure that we take care of ourselves really allows us to make sure that we also show up ready to help our clients. And then finally, some recommendations for social work and what we can do better. And for Dr. Robinson, this really came down to resources, both resources for therapists and resources for clients. She highlighted especially the importance of insurance and making sure that therapists are aware of the benefits of taking insurance, both for them and for their clients. Of course, taking insurance makes therapy more financially accessible to clients, which helps the clients and also helps the therapist because you may get more clients that way. And then for clients as well, she discussed just needing better access to information for clients, both in terms of resources for receiving mental health services, but also other resources that go beyond, mental health and therapy. that may still be resulting from their loss or their grief. For example, after the death of a spouse or a partner, an individual might lose their house or have some instability there. So things like that can also come up, just the need for greater access to resources and information there. But all in all, I really learned a great deal from my interview and from researching this topic more broadly, in particular, the complexities of grieving a suicide loss and what we as future clinicians need to do in order to be adequately prepared to work effectively with this population. And then I have my references here. That's it. Thank you.